and welcome to the Sports Business Podcast with Prof. C, the podcast that explores the world of professional, collegiate, amateur, and Olympic sports. I'm Mark Conrad, or Prof. C, from Fordham University's Gabelli School of Business, where I serve as Professor of Law and Ethics and the Director of the Sports Business Initiative. The National Football League is an economic and cultural powerhouse whose business has gone from strength to strength. NFL games consistently draw huge television audiences. The league is pushing to gain new international markets. Its team values are soaring. Commissioner Roger Goodell is the regent, and the owners are the princes and princesses of this kingdom. How did the NFL become the envy of the sports world? How did the league monetize its product so successfully? How was it able to exercise bare-knuckled ruthlessness in dealing with government, politicians, and media executives? How did it become part of our culture? The answers are found in a new book titled Every Day is Sunday: How Jerry Jones, Robert Kraft, and Roger Goodell turned the NFL into a cultural and economic juggernaut. The author is Ken Belson. Ken writes about the business of sports for the New York Times and joins us for this edition of The Business of Sports with Prof. C. Ken started his career at the New York Times as a reporter in Tokyo in the business section. He also worked in the Metro section and in 2009 joined the sports section of the Times. In 2023, he rejoined the business section after the Times acquired The Athletic and moved its sports coverage to that journal. One disclosure, Ken and I have known each other for about a decade, and Ken has quoted me in some of his stories. Ken, welcome to the Sports Business Podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Mark. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. So let's start. Your book focuses on two owners, Jerry Jones of the Dallas Cowboys and Robert Kraft of the New England Patriots. There are many other notable owners, so why did you focus on those two?
Well, it's a writing device. You have to limit the number of people you keep in focus and then relegate some other people to the background or occasional characters. That's just to keep it simple. As you can see from the title, you can only fit so many names on there. That's the first answer. The second answer is Jones and Kraft have been the most successful owners since they came into the league. Jerry in 1989, Robert in 1994. Their teams currently, maybe not right now, but have been over the last 2 decades, the number one and number two most valuable franchises. Jerry won 3 Super Bowls. Robert has won 6 and has been to 4 others. So they have been mainstays of both the NFC and the AFC. And then their influence within the league, I'm not talking about their teams, but their influence on various committees, the media rights negotiations, the contract talks with the unions, sponsorships, international, even gambling. Both of them have had stakes in outfits that later became gambling companies. So they've been so involved in every aspect of the league or building the league over the last 30 plus years. It's hard to find 2 other owners who stand out that way. And then the third thing is, and I don't want to short circuit myself here because we'll talk a little more about this. They actually have, although Jerry came from Arkansas and Robert came from Boston, had very similar trajectories as business people before they got to the NFL. So for all those reasons, it made sense to choose those 2.
And you compare them in the book. You've covered them, spent time with them, as they are 2 very different personalities with arguably different approaches to business, who somehow teamed up to produce this formidable duo, helping expand the media and marketing of the league. In a sentence or two, how would you describe their personalities?
Well, to people who have been around the NFL, it's old hat. They know about them. But Jerry is this hard-driving, lives large. He's such a character. He speaks in non sequiturs. His sentences often even don't make sense at all, especially when I go back to the transcripts. And yet he's a dreamer. He's constantly coming up with ideas. He's constantly lobbying other owners to bring them on board. His vision for the NFL is 2x anybody else's vision among the owners. Robert, on the other hand, is a little bit more reserved, a bit more of a diplomat. He may not get credit for having generated the ideas, but he certainly gets credit for synthesizing them. There might be 3 or 4 opinions in a room, and Robert's usually the guy who can corral everybody around a central idea. So one and Jerry might come up with the ideas, and Robert is very good at executing them.
And you also focus, of course, on NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell and discuss the transition from former Commissioner Paul Tagliabue. Tagliabue was an attorney who litigated cases for the league. Goodell, on the other hand, is not an attorney, but he took the league to a new level. What do you think are some of Goodell's achievements?
Well, Roger's an interesting figure. He's been at the league his entire professional life. It's now going on 45 years. He knows every one of the owners individually. Frankly, some of these owners, he's contemporaries. They were young executives, sons of owners who became owners themselves. So Roger, as I point out in the book, is not so much a CEO or what we think of as a commissioner, but he's more like a Senate majority leader. He's somebody who figures out, he reads the room very well, let's put it that way, and finds, again, a middle ground. He understands more than most commissioners that he is employed by those owners. And it's really, he may have his own ideas on where the NFL should go, but he generally reserves judgment until he hears from the owners and tries to figure out what they really want. And of course, with 32 owners, 32 successful people, you have sometimes 32 different ideas. But Roger's very good at reading the room, and I'd say that's his main strength.
Is ruthlessness the middle name of the NFL? And if so, are there any examples from the book that describes how it can steamroll its opponents?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's certainly the popular image of the league is ruthlessness. It's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. It's tripled in revenue under Roger Goodell's leadership since 2006. And frankly, will only get bigger because their share of the media pie has grown so much. And so in that way, yes, they're ruthless. Leagues, not just the NFL, but other leagues, baseball, but basketball, have gotten criticized for putting more and more of their games on paid television services like streaming accounts, Amazon, Peacock, and so forth. And in that way, they're seen popularly as greedy. And Roger, let's face it, he's very good at leverage. And there's an anecdote in the book with negotiations with NBC back in the day, and Dick Ebersol, essentially calls Roger an SOB. He knows how far he can push these networks because he knows the networks need the NFL. And one of the lawyers who worked for the NFL for quite a long time, Frank Hawkins, said that. He said, Roger understands leverage better than anybody he knows. He knows his opponent, and he knows what he has, and he knows what or how far he can push. So I'd say on the media front in particular, that's been his strength. You may know from watching CNBC and elsewhere, he shows up now at the summits, the media summits. He's as much a media leader as Bob Iger, Brian Roberts. He mixes and mingles with them, and they need him, frankly, because the NFL is the hottest product on television.
With so many of the top television events, NFL games, you clearly see that utter dependency between the NFL and broadcasters, particularly traditional over-the-air broadcasters, who have been really having their power reduced over the years because of new media. We're speaking with Ken Belson, the business and sports writer for the New York Times, who is the author of Every Day is Sunday, How Jerry Jones, Robert Kraft, and Roger Goodell Turned the NFL into a Cultural and Economic Juggernaut. Your book delves into the team relocations of the 1980s and 90s when a number of franchises, such as the Raiders, the Rams, the Browns, the Colts, and the Cardinals, moved to different cities. And in doing so, the teams extracted financial support for state-of-the-art facilities from local officials. One that comes to mind was the move by the Rams from St. Louis back to Los Angeles, leaving St. Louis with a stadium that had built for a team, but turned out to be a venue without a tenant. Could you tell us what happened?
In that particular instance, that's interesting because Stan Kroenke, the owner of the Rams, left to build his own stadium in Los Angeles. He actually got very little public support to build in Inglewood, California. But Stan Kroenke's also the second, or perhaps now the third wealthiest owner. He owned the land in LA, and obviously even spending $5 billion for a new stadium there, the value of his team is exploded because, let's face it, LA is a much bigger and more lucrative market than St. Louis. But what St. Louis had done, and what Stan Kroenke was trying to get out of, was they built, back in the early 90s, they built a stadium on spec, which is absurd when you think about it, that a city or a county in their case would put together hundreds of millions of dollars just to build a building without a tenant. And that's because the Arizona Cardinals, who used to be the St. Louis Cardinals, had left in 1988, and the city was desperate to get another team. So what better way to get a better team? Build a stadium and tell an owner, here it is. Come on, move in. You don't have to worry about construction, financing, whatever. It's there for you to move right in. They were not the only city to do this. Baltimore did it, and they got the Cleveland Browns to move to town. But it was a pretty extreme example. There's also in baseball, where the Tampa Bay Rays play, that building was built on spec and actually sat empty for several years without a baseball tenant. And of course, they ultimately got one. So they're not alone in that, St. Louis, but they built it specifically to bring a team back. The terms were pretty darn generous, and the Rams, benefited from all of that. And they won their Super Bowl there, the greatest show on turf. So it paid off if you're St. Louis, in the sense that they got a team back and the team won. But, the building started to get old. Let's face it, 1995 to about 2013, 2014, it's almost 20 years. In stadium terms these days, you got to put a lot more money in it to make it quote unquote modern. And so the Rams started lobbying for ways to leave, basically. And they had various opt-outs in their contract that the city and county, had a hard time defending. And so Stan took advantage of it. He did buy the old Hollywood racetrack in Los Angeles, and that was the land he ultimately built his stadium on. So I think it's a good example in the sense that St. Louis went to extreme measures to get a team and then ended up losing a team because it was very hard to keep them after that.
And the lease term is fascinating because it said that after a certain period of time, if the stadium was not, quote, state of the art, unquote, the team could breach the lease early because I think it was originally a 30-year lease, or that's usually how long they are. But it was after 15 or 20 years, they could say, well, if the stadium is not up to date, we can leave early. And an arbitrator said it was not up to date based on the newest stadiums because there was a spate of stadium construction around the early 2000s. And yes, it was an older stadium, and they used that to leave. Although, to be fair, St. Louis sued the team in the NFL and did get a reasonable settlement out of that determination.
Yeah, it's important to understand that over the 80s, or in the 80s, starting in particular with Al Davis going from Oakland to Los Angeles, the league has had significant issues being accused of antitrust violations by trying to prevent teams from exercising their right to move. And so that led to a lot of chaos. And, Paul Tagliabue, who's interviewed in the book, noted that when teams started moving, and then the league tried to prevent them, and Al Davis turned around and sued and said, you can't prevent me from moving. It's my team. I can do what I want. It allowed other teams to move too. Bob Irsay moved the Colts to Indianapolis because the league was powerless while the lawsuit was going on. Because if they tried to stop the Colts, they would prove Al Davis correct, and then they would lose that case. So they were in a real bind. And so you do see a handful of moves kind of snowball in a short period of time because lawsuits are in the middle of it. But, look, the league doesn't want these things in general. It's very disruptive. You alienate fans. They're expensive. Obviously, the legal costs. And it's a bad look to be abandoning a market. But, a decade later, is the NFL happy they're in Los Angeles over St. Louis? I'd say, yeah, they are. And I would say also there's sometimes a split in ownership. The older owners, the Rooneys and the Maras come to mind. They've been in their markets since they were started as franchises. they tend not to like this. They tend to see, sort of more traditional view that we're there, make the best of it, work with fans. But the newer owners, they see valuations going up. And by the way, when the Rams went from, say, the 30th most valuable franchise to the second, everybody else's boats rose with them. So the owners, in that sense, to go back to your earlier question, the owners do seem very ruthless when it comes to things like relocation.
And moving on then onto more social issues now, the NFL was criticized in 2016 and 17 when Colin Kaepernick took the knee to protest racism during the Black Lives Matter era. And of course, this incurred the wrath of President Trump during his first term. The book describes how the NFL owners were divided on how to respond. Could you describe some of the backroom tension among the owners?
Yeah, there's a whole chapter based on a recording I got of the owners discussing with the players how to address the issue. This is October 2017, just weeks after the president attacked the league, encouraged the owners to fire any players who protested and so on. It was really kind of existential crisis for the league because although there's been issues like steroids and concussions, those are sort of football, those are inward looking issues about the league itself. This is something where, sorry for the pun, but the league itself became a social football, where now the rest of America was looking at what the NFL was doing in a very different way. And so they were really struggling. And you can hear it on that tape and in their comments. And so you basically had about 11 owners. They were mostly there was two blocks basically. Pretty conservative owners, Bob McNair of the Texans, Terry Pegula of the Bills on one side, and you had some pretty liberal or progressive owners, Jeffrey Lurie being the most prominent example of the Eagles, Steve Ross, who's put together an institute to fight racism, and then Robert Kraft was somewhere in the middle between the two sets of them. And then on the other side, you had a dozen players. It's very rare for the players to speak in groups to owners like this outside of labor negotiations. And you can feel the tension in the room. There was a significant group, Malcolm Jenkins, Anquan Bolden, who were part of what's known as the Players Coalition, and they were trying to come up with a solution, which included money for grassroots funding. But there were other players like Eric Reed, who stood up at the meeting and basically said, "Where's Kaepernick? I mean, he's the guy that got all this rolling and he can't get a job now." So, it was a very, very tense meeting. Roger Goodell only started the meeting and basically sat back and let both sides come to an agreement. And ultimately they did. They formed a group called a program called Inspire Change. But it was a very, very tense moment. And, there were some interesting asides there. There was one owner who basically trashed the president. There were other owners, like Bob McNair, who said, to the players, "Why don't you just tell your compadres, tell your friends to just stop kneeling," as if these players had any control over, 2,000 other players. So there were some really goofy moments there. Steve Ross of the Dolphins even said, "What we really need is a march on Washington, similar to the march on Selma, Alabama in 1965. That one didn't go over particularly well. Just a little bit too offbeat.
Now, you detailed the meeting and the recording was secretly done. How did you come about, or how did the recording come to you? Probably from a source. And what do you think the reaction was on all the parties when you reported on it?
So it's certain things I can't tell you, like who my source was, but this was early 2018. The season had ended. Kaepernick was now out of the league for a full year, and I was asked to, continue to follow up. I was told about the tape. It took quite a few weeks, at least more than a month, to listen to it. I was not given it initially, and then there were all sorts of terms and so forth. And then even when I had possession of it and started to listen to it in full, there were, I had to tread carefully on when I could publish it. So yeah, that was that. As for the reaction to it, as a reporter, there's no there's no better story you can write than when you have the audio, because there's no way to deny it. I knew all these owners. I knew their voices. I didn't know all the players, so I didn't include every single player. I knew what Goodell sounded like, DeMaurice Smith. So I had it, I had them saying it. And so the morning the story appeared, I wrote to, I think there were 8 owners who were cited in the story. I wrote to each of the 8 owners and I said, I have this tape. We're writing a story about it. Your owner, you or your owner is quoted saying this. There was really no room for them to say, I never said that, because I had the recording. And so several of the people wrote back and said, thank you for letting me know. It's better to know in advance. And this was, say, an hour in advance of publication. A couple of people wrote back saying, could you just leave out the quote? And I said, no, I won't divulge the owner. It's not fair to the PR person in this case. But the PR person said, you and I know he sounds like this, but it just doesn't sound right. I said, look, he said it. I know you have to ask me, but we're going to run this quote. And the person said, no, I appreciate it. I just had to ask and try. But it was the most unvarnished you'll ever hear them in a group, because they did not expect to be recorded. It was a secret recording. And so there was nobody. It was funny because at the beginning, Roger Goodell even says to the room, let's have this off the record. It's just better if we talk amongst ourselves. So he even knew it would be a sensitive meeting, but somebody in the room taped it.
Well, and how did the NFL move from that controversy?
So I note this several times in the book, but the NFL is very good at marketing. And in cases like this, and this is not the only example, but in cases like this, they tend to try and move forward. They acknowledge the issue in some cases like domestic violence, bullying, and then they quickly try and figure out, how can we turn this into something else? How can we address it by giving money to a nonprofit center, as they did in the case of the domestic violence, and put together public service campaigns, commercials. I remember Eli Manning being on one after the Ray Rice issue. And that's what they did here. There was already a program that was bubbling up about that would allow players to give money to grassroots groups, doing work addressing bail reform and police brutality and things that the players were interested in. And so the league came out with a program that was sort of more formal, and it called Inspire Change, in which the owners would match money that the players put into various charitable efforts. And that's the way they move forward. And then, as you see, in fact, I think it's usually in October, the players can wear messages on their cleats. It's expanded over time. Certainly after George Floyd in 2020, there's language at the ends of the end zones, end racism, all sorts of things like that come together. So there's a lot of messaging that they allow the players to do around the causes that they care about. The cleats, players can design their own cleats for a variety of causes. So yeah, that's how they've done it. They've essentially, the cynics will say they co-opted the players, but it did give the players more of a voice, and it certainly put more money into the causes they believed in.
Now we're in the second Trump administration. And how do you think the league is going to deal with the potential headwinds or the actual headwinds coming from the White House, as the president is certainly very interested in sports and has made a number of comments and executive orders dealing with sports? So what do you think the league has planned in dealing with potential issues coming up right now or in the future?
Well, I think a little bit unlike the first term. The first term was different in the sense that the owners were more out front, having supported him. I believe 7, it could be 8, owners gave $1 million or more to his inaugural fundraising effort around his inauguration in 2017. This time, the owners are much more reluctant to talk about him. Having said that, the NFL has already made outreach to the president. He was at the Super Bowl, for instance, and when they announced that the draft was going to be in Washington in 2027, they did it in the Oval Office. So I think by trying to include him in more NFL activities. I think that's their way of trying to make sure that they're have a good relationship with him in a way that maybe was less obvious back in the first term. But, who knows? It could be something during the football season that catches the president's eye that leads to, a bunch of tweets or something else. It's a little hard to predict sometimes, but I think the NFL, to put a bow on this, I think the NFL is trying to be more proactive right now.
Do you think that they're walking on eggshells with this?
I think everybody is. I think every league, every company, the economy, name the topic. The president seems to shoot from the hip sometimes, and companies have to try and get out ahead of it and anticipate it. But at the end of the day, he's the president. He can issue an executive order. There's a lot of things he can do to disrupt things. Having said that, he loves sports. I mean, he was at the U.S. Open final the other day. He was at Yankee Stadium on Thursday night here in New York on 9/11. So it's a comfort area for him. And as much as the NFL can make him feel welcome, I think that probably will insulate them to a certain degree.
In the book, you quote an NFL staffer as saying, quote, Roger Goodell does not view the other leagues as competition. He wants to be mentioned with Disney and the Vatican, these massive institutions, unquote. Do you think this is hyperbole, or do you think that the NFL has become a cultural quasi-religion entertainment center under his leadership?
This is one of my favorite quotes in the book. I think it puts the league in perspective, and it puts Roger in perspective in a way that, the average fan doesn't quite see. And this is a business book. So keep in mind, I'm looking at it through that lens. The average fan will look at Adam Silver of the NBA and Rob Manfred and Roger Goodell as commissioners, but that's a silo and or a sports bubble. But Roger Goodell, I think, and the owners know they have something that's much bigger than that. As we alluded to, more than 70 of the top most watched programs were football games last year. The Super Bowl is essentially a national holiday. They're expanding overseas. They're the most gambled on sport by far, college football included. So, the interest level is head and shoulders above all the other leagues, not fan by fan or market by market, but in aggregate. And so, Roger Goodell isn't necessarily seeing himself as just another sports league. And by Disney, I think that quote is signaling that he sees the NFL as a media company that happens to produce a product known as football. And the Vatican, I thought, was really clever. And it kind of alluded to the idea that football or the NFL has become an institution. I noted in the chapter on Super Bowls that Super Bowl Sunday is the worst day to get married. You'll never get anybody to come to your wedding. It's the most food consumed on a single day outside of Thanksgiving. And that happened organically. The NFL didn't try to do that. It's just a very captivating product. It's probably because of the halftime show. It's often the only football game many Americans will watch, outside of the actual football fans. So, and then of course, international. My wife was in Japan last year during the Super Bowl, and she got one of the game passes for 99 cents. And she watched the Super Bowl because Taylor Swift was going to be there. This is 2 years ago already. So the stories just are way beyond the NFL at a certain point. And then you have to get back and remind yourself, oh, yeah, right, there's a football game being played. There's no other sport that does that.
We continue our conversation with Ken Belson, business and sports writer for the New York Times, who's the author of Every Day is Sunday, How Jerry Jones, Robert Kraft, and Roger Goodell turned the NFL into a cultural and economic juggernaut. On the issue of the halftime show, you do mention in the book that the reason it started is because in the early years, the halftime show was more of a marching band, more of a college sports-ish kind of situation. And the NFL noted the ratings went down during that portion of the broadcast. So the idea was to make the entertainment segment more of a part of the event. And certainly it has worked, I think, beyond anybody's expectations.
Yeah, there's an interesting story that, yes, the first bunch of years, they were marching bands, Grambling and all sorts of college bands. And then in the 80s, you may remember, we're old enough to remember Up With the People, this sort of youth celebration, lots of singers on the field. And that was a pet project of Don Weiss, who ran the Super Bowl for many years. But in 1992, Fox, which was a relatively new network at that time, ran counter programming against the halftime show. And many fans changed the channel to watch, I don't believe it was In Living Color or The Simpsons, but they ran some comedy show. And so for half an hour, people tuned out, and that scared the living daylights out of the NFL owners. And they realized they were letting, prime real estate in the TV world. Because remember, there's ads embedded in all of this. And the price of those ads is based on viewership. And if the Coca-Colas and the pizza companies of the world know that people are changing the channel, the ad prices aren't going to rise as fast. So the following year, they had to make a big splash. And that's when they got Michael Jackson. And that was in Pasadena. And it was also the first time they had a naming sponsor to help pay for it. I believe it was Doritos. PepsiCo was the sponsor, which helped pay for the Michael Jackson act to come out. And he really hit a home run. And so really starting in 1993, the level of talent rose exponentially. They went for the biggest pop stars, the biggest rock stars. And of course, we see this now in every genre that they bring out, whether it's rap music or country music. And then, of course, they had the wardrobe malfunction in Jacksonville. And that led, or maybe it was Houston, excuse me. And then it led to a real reappraisal of who was running it, because the NFL was outsourcing some of this. And, so starting in the year after that, Janet Jackson Super Bowl, they started to get more predictable, mainstream acts, Paul McCartney, Bruce Springsteen, who, sort of the baby boomer, groups. And then they had much more editorial control over the content at that point.
Right. MTV did that one under contract. For those of you young enough, like my students may not remember this, but for those of you above a certain age, you probably do remember these so-called wardrobe malfunction, as it was put, when there was about half a second of frontal nudity at the very end of that show. And I saw it, my wife saw it, and it was just for half a second. We said, something happened there, and then went right to a commercial. But the half a second was enough to cause a kind of a national outrage. And Tagliabue was brought to Congress and had to testify. And I guess the NFL realized that they better not do this again. You also state in the book that Goodell, quote, is not paid just to make money for the owners. He's also paid to deflect criticism and solve problems. And one of those problems involved players who were engaged in transgressions, and his use of a broadened personal conduct policy made for rocky relations between the owners and with the public. So you discuss the events in the book and Goodell's dilemma. How do you describe how Goodell navigated through this?
Well, it's interesting. He, in the years leading up to Goodell becoming commissioner in 2006, Paul Tagliabue really had kind of a hands-off approach to this issue of player off-field problems, not necessarily on-field. On-field is adjudicated. There's a table of fines and suspensions that you get for certain activities, whether it's taunting or knocking a quarterback over or spitting on a player, something like that. That's pretty well established, and that is in the CBA and in the labor deal. It's often spelled out. But the off-field stuff, driving drunk, getting in a bar fight, those kinds of things, the number of those high-profile cases had started to rise to the point where the NFL, it was starting to affect the NFL's public perception or the image of the NFL. And so when Roger Goodell came in 2006, he really kind of said, I'm the new sheriff in town, and I'm going to really police this more aggressively. And so he used this personal conduct policy, I guess you would say, expanded his use of it to really come down hard on certain players. Adam Pac-Man Jones was sort of the most notorious early example, and so, but there were many others. And so the players quickly felt like victims in this, that the commissioner was doing this arbitrarily, that there was no system to it. Unlike, say, steroids, getting caught taking steroids or fighting on the field, there's an established criteria: first offense, second offense, and so forth. This was very much left up to the commissioner. And so there was pushback, but they were between labor deals. And so there really wasn't much they could do except complain. It came up in the 2011 labor deal, but unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, but Roger Goodell was burned several times by overstepping, his authority. And one of them was in the famous Bounty Gate in New Orleans, where some players were found to have been rewarded for hurting opposing teams, players on opposing teams. And so the problem with the personal conduct policy wasn't just that Roger Goodell had sort of unlimited authority to penalize players, but he also heard the appeals, which is sort of a ridiculous setup that no matter if you appeal, he's going to hear it a second time. And so there was a ruling where Roger Goodell said, "Okay, I'll have Paul Tagliabue come in and look at it." So he brings his old boss back in, and his boss actually let the players off the hook. He said the players shouldn't be penalized for this. The coaches who ordered it should be. And so it was a win for the players, a loss for the coaches, but it was a bit embarrassing to Goodell. And so over time, he has stepped back, I should say tiptoed back, and given away some of his authority. But by and large, he still has ultimate authority over the personal conduct policy.
And in many cases, he did win. He did win in appeals in the courts. It's a kind of a de facto arbitration system. And you can try to go to court to vacate an arbitration ruling, which for those of you on the law side is really, really tough to do. And he won a lot. He won in the Deflategate case. And just as a bit of a story on that case, I went on air on a certain television network predicting the NFL would lose that case in the court. Well, I have not predicted anything since. So they didn't, because they said this is this provision that was agreed to. It's kind of strange. But basically, at the time, the commission was the judge, jury, and appeals court.
Yeah, that's right, Mark. And because they have a collective bargaining agreement, the judges will often say, look, if the players don't like it, then negotiate next time and figure out a way to win back more power or dilute the commissioner's power. And that's where the courts generally land. But Goodell has lost in other cases. He lost in the Ray Rice case because Ray Rice had been suspended for 2 games initially for punching his fiance. And then after the second video of him doing this came out, Roger Goodell suspended him indefinitely, and that was double jeopardy, or double indemnity. And so Ray Rice appealed this, and Judge Barbara Jones agreed that you can't penalize a guy 2 times for the same infraction. So there have been cases where Goodell has lost, but by and large, yes, the courts have upheld his right to have this policy because it's in a collectively bargained agreement.
Right. And one of the most moving sections of the book was your chapter outlining the NFL's approach to player injuries and the class action lawsuit between former players and the league regarding neurological damage from playing football. And you did interview former players and their families as part of the story. How difficult was it to see some of the former players who may have been stars or very well known, but whose mental and physical conditions deteriorated after years of playing in the NFL?
It's tough. I'll say that the reason I ended up covering the NFL, I was a general sports business writer. I was covering baseball and all sorts of other topics and leagues and events. But I started writing about the litigation that you referenced to, became class action litigation. I had a story, I want to say it was at the end of 2011, on the growing number of cases that were being filed around the country in state and federal court by former players who were very frustrated that the league was leaving them out and ignoring them. So that's really when it started. And that's where my editor said, this is going to be a bigger story. Why don't you just cover the NFL? So it was around 2012, 2013 that started. So I've been on this issue for, now it's more than a dozen years, 13 years, 14 years. And unfortunately, the stories start to sound the same. Sadly, the players, finish their careers. They sometimes go into second careers, raise families, and eventually you have this the neurological and cognitive problems start to encroach. Families don't know how to deal with it. They're left on their own. There's no early diagnosis for losing your keys or forgetting where you're driving or having outrage or those kinds of things. So it's really hard on the families in particular, as much as it is on the players. They don't really know what's going on. It's a hard thing to sort of diagnose. If you break your leg or you need a hip replacement, it's obvious. But when when the brain's involved, it's very different. And it's hard to know how much of this is just aging and how much of this is being accelerated. And so when you meet a 45-year-old player who's got the cognitive skills of a 65-year-old, you start to wonder, but it's hard to see when you're living it, right? And so that's been the most heart-wrenching part is the players and particularly their families, how they've had to kind of pick up and hang, usually the players were the breadwinners, were the rock of the family, and now the roles were reversed. And I've sat, unfortunately, sat in many living rooms with families who've just cried. Junior Seau's family, Demaryius Thomas's family. There are many players, unfortunately, who died and were later found with CTE. And it's a really hard thing to watch.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify one thing, that the NFL in its settlement did not contest the causal element, the connection between playing and the injury. So hence, that's why we noted that there was that connection, at least because it was admitted as part of that settlement. Had it been litigated, that would have potentially been defense. How do you know it came from playing in the NFL?
Yeah, this causal relationship is one of the reasons why I think the plaintiffs' lawyers encourage the players to settle, because if you had to go to court and say, I got this concussion on this day in 1980 and this led to blah, 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 it's almost impossible to do that. I mean, concussions weren't really diagnosed the same way. Medical records are gone. And so the lawyers said, look, if the NFL is not going to say what caused this, and you can just say, I have ALS or I have Parkinson's, and then don't worry about how it happened. Well, that's as much of a sort of tacit acknowledgement without you having to go through the rigmarole of trying to prove it. And so in that way, it was groundbreaking as a settlement.
Yeah, indeed. Although flawed in certain ways, as you noted in the book. In one portion, you compare the owners' meetings to a high school cafeteria. How do you explain how billionaire owners can act like high school kids?
Well, that was an allusion to sort of the pettiness of where they sit and this sort of crazy system they had. They don't have it anymore, but for many years there were no assigned seats. But like every classroom you've ever been in, kids tend to sit in the same seats every time, and they sort of naturally end up in this row or in the back or in the front or something like that. And that's kind of how it went, except the owners being, controlling and wanting to sit in certain places with certain other owners would send their underlings down to the meeting rooms at 5 a.m. to squat, basically, to put paper and bags all over because this is where Al Davis likes to sit, and gosh darn it, he better get that seat. And sure enough, there were little cliques. There were, Alex Spanos of the Chargers and Al Davis were good friends. They always used to sit together. In fact, to this day, the Chargers and Raiders kind of hang out together, even though the principals are now, the sons are now in charge of both teams. The Rooneys and the Maras, so forth. Robert Kraft still sits in the very first row, right in front of the dais. Jerry Jones for many years sat with Dan Snyder. So there are these little pockets around the room of owners that were friendly with each other for various reasons. Some of them dated back to the AFL days, the Broncos and the Chiefs, for instance. New owners came in. There's a funny anecdote in there from Shad Khan of the Jaguars. And he said that Wayne Weaver, who sold the team to him, really gave him no advice on how to be an owner, except after he was approved at a meeting in Dallas in 2011. They came out of the meeting room and Wayne Weaver said only one thing: keep the seat. And as it turns out, the Jaguars sat across from Robert Kraft in the very front of the room, and Jerry Jones sat a couple of seats down to the left. And he never explained why, except Shad's only thought was, the Jaguars are not the most prominent team. They don't carry a lot of weight in the league. They're in a small market, but the proximity to Jerry and Robert was really important. That'll add stature, and you'll learn a lot from them by being near them. And so in a way, Wayne Weaver made a very good suggestion, and Shad took it to heart, and he has become friendly with both Jerry and Robert and watched how they worked.
And you write about the relations between Goodell and the now former Players Union executive director, DeMaurice Smith, and note that they were frosty, which differed from the prior relations between Commissioner Tagliabue and the then union head, Gene Upshaw. Why do you think the interactions between Goodell and Smith were more adversarial than the predecessors?
There's a couple of reasons. By the time Tagliabue became commissioner in 1989, he had been around the league for 20 years as their counsel, their outside counsel. And so he was very familiar with all the key players before he even became commissioner, including Gene Upshaw. So there was some history there. Gene Upshaw was a very different union leader. He was a former player and a well-respected both player and union leader. And he was very sure of himself. And if you wanted anything done, you had to start with Gene. It's a very different dynamic when DeMaurice Smith comes in. Gene Upshaw died of pancreatic cancer in 2008, quite suddenly. There's a surge. DeMaurice takes over in March of 2009. And so he's now thrust in this, first of all, it would have been hard in a normal situation, but now he's taking over for a legend, a guy who'd been there for 25 years, a Hall of Fame player. It would have been hard under any circumstance. But now DeMaurice Smith, who has no experience in the pro sports world, comes in and has to both fill his shoes at a time when the owners want to opt out of their labor agreement. So they're heading into battle. So it was a real trial by fire. DeMaurice Smith had to basically prove his muscle. He didn't have the reputation Gene had. He didn't have the relationships. So he kind of had to go in with guns blazing to show the players, his own constituents, that, hey, I'm going to come out here and fight for you. I don't have a track record, but I'm your guy. At the same time, signal to Goodell, I'm not a pushover. And so that created, for better or for worse, it created a dynamic where he had to be more adversarial than he might have been otherwise. I don't know. He was a prosecutor, so maybe that's part of his instinct is to push that envelope. But yeah, it set up a very different dynamic. And then they're very different people. I mean, there's a little scene in the book about somebody describing meetings between the two of them. And the person said when Roger has a meeting with DeMaurice Smith, he's going to be briefed, he's going to study up, and if it's at 10 o'clock, he'll be ready at 9:55. DeMaurice Smith, it could be 9:55, it could be 10, could be 10:15, and he might deliberately even wing it a little bit to try and get Goodell off kilter. When I asked George Atala, who worked for D, I said, well, what was that all about? And he said, well, look, I think D felt like the real power in the room was the owners, and Goodell was just a functionary. So why should I pay deference to Goodell when I really have to do battle with Jerry Richardson, Jerry Jones, Robert Kraft? And so it was a very different approach. I'd say, in some ways it worked, in some ways it didn't.
Well, in the book, actually, you focus on, of course, Goodell and Jerry Jones and Kraft. But there are other owners as well. And I would ask very bluntly, which owner do you think was the hardest asked in the NFL?
Well, it depends on which, what you mean by that, or in what avenue. I would say Jerry Richardson, the late Jerry Richardson of the Carolina Panthers, was considered a real traditionalist, hard ass in other ways. He was in charge of the stadium committee and did a lot of work to lobby governments to provide hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies to the owners. When it came to the labor negotiations, particularly in 2011, he was considered one of the most hardline owners in the room. There's a scene recounted there at a meeting at the Super Bowl in Dallas in February 2011, before the deadline for the contract talks ran out and before the lockout started, where Jerry Richardson was presenting to the players and the other owners, and actually said to Peyton Manning, if you need help with that, reading that spreadsheet, son, you let me know. And it was a very derogatory, or was perceived to be a very derogatory comment, and it pissed the players off. And he was the one who rallied the owners to take a hard line during that period, feeling that the previous labor deal was too generous to the players. So he wanted to call all that money back. I'd say he's one of them. Mike Brown is a very different figure, very traditional, probably the least sort of entrepreneurial of all the owners. If there's ever a vote that's 31-1, the one is typically Mike Brown. He voted against allowing private equity funds to invest in NFL teams, just to give you a mindset. For him and his father, Paul Brown, the famous coach, it's all about football between the lines, and everything else is a distraction. It's also why the Bengals are one of the least valued teams. I say least, but still well into the billions.
Yeah.
I'd say both of those on different ways are pretty hard-assed, as you said.
Okay. Who are the most colorful?
Well, Jerry's top of the list. He might not have been always that way, because there were many colorful owners back in the day. Al Davis was always a great quote. Art Modell, Leonard Tose of the Eagles, who was both a drinker and a gambler, used to bring a reclining chair to NFL meetings, like a Barcalounger. There were some real characters back in the day. Carol Rosenblum. But those days are gone, and there are many more people who come into the league having made their fortunes, particularly in the finance area, where they tend to be very conservative with the media. When I say conservative, I mean reluctant to speak in the media. But Jerry is still out there. He learned very early on. There's a great anecdote in there. Jared Bell of the USA Today, the columnist, he worked for the Cowboys before and after Jerry took over. And Jerry asked him, he said, the team is 1-15 or 3-13, whatever they were that year. How is it that the general manager gets the benefit of the doubt in the newspaper? And Jared said, well, he's always available. Like, people can call him at home, ask him any question you want. He'll always answer it. He said that buys goodwill with reporters. And so Jerry understood that, if I'm just available, I'll get the benefit of the doubt, or at least it'll help me build a relationship with the media. And so Jerry took that and ran with it. And he also has, he's just fun. I mean, he cracks jokes. He does it with a smile. He's got very thick skin. He gets criticized because he's a general manager. He gets criticized because he's an owner. He gets right back up and he'll talk to people. He by leaps and bounds, he's the most colorful owner.
We continue our conversation with Ken Belson, business and sports writer for the New York Times, and the author of Every Day is Sunday: How Jerry Jones, Robert Kraft, and Roger Goodell turned the NFL into a cultural and economic juggernaut. And sticking with Jerry Jones, that here was an owner that was quite influential at one time and ultimately morphed to a non-entity. How did that happen? He owned the Carolina Panthers, but how did he become persona non grata in the NFL?
Yeah, when I started writing the book, Jerry Richardson had died. This was in early 2023, and I actually wrote Jerry's obituary for the New York Times. And so I was intrigued about how this powerful owner, had this large presence, only the second former player to become an owner, the first being George Halas. How did he just sort of disappear? And there was, of course, this incident in the end of this very powerful Sports Illustrated story in 2017, alleging that he used racist language and that he was condescending and maybe even too aggressive with women. And that he basically was going to sell his team, and he basically said, all right, I don't want to stick around for this. And he sold his team in a relatively short period. The deal closed about 6 months later. And then he was forgotten. I mean, a guy who had put a lot on the line. He was the only owner in the league who did not put his team's logo at the 50-yard line. If you look at NFL stadiums, mostly it'll say Giants or Jets or whatever. His was always the NFL Shield. His idea was, we're all part of a league. He was a league first owner, but he was a hard ass, as the language you used. And yet he was gone. He was sort of forgotten. Now, COVID may have had something to do with that. So I was intrigued by that. I went to his memorial service to see how many owners showed up. And basically, Paul Tagliabue was there, Jeff Pash, the general counsel, and there were only 3 owners that I could count. And I thought, boy, for all the work he put in on behalf of the owners and just on behalf of his own team, only 3 of them managed to make it. I thought that was kind of a sad indictment. Now, some of them may have reached out to Jerry individually or gone to a different service or spoken to his wife, at other times. But it was very telling how quickly he was kind of forgotten after all the work he put in.
Hmm. And speaking of interesting owners, you do devote a portion of a chapter to Dan Snyder, who is the former owner of the then Washington Redskins, now the Washington Commanders. Would you say that he was one of the worst, if not the worst owner you covered, like in a general scope? And if so, what does it say about his $800 million investment resulting in a $6 billion sale price, despite the lack of success of a team?
Yeah, Dan Snyder was complicated, to say the least. Certainly when I came along, he had already owned the club for 12, 13 years. And it already, whatever antipathy he had with the other reporters was well established, particularly the Washington media. He got very combative. He stopped talking to the media. The comments he would make were sort of off the chart sometimes. So I had very little interaction because he basically would ignore the media and run the other direction. And he had people would speak for him in the media. So he was a hard guy to read, but because he, unlike Jerry, had very thin skin, he would take offense at stories about him. But by the time I came along in 2013, the big issue was the name of the team, which some Native American groups really opposed, considered racist, and he doubled down on it. He said, "I'm not leaving." He fought it in court. Various courts. He lost some decisions and then won finally. So he just really saw no middle ground, with him. It was a very absolute relationship. And he was just so, abrasive to, people inside and outside the building, that he really lost a lot of friends. And, if you speak to the owners, they don't want to say anything publicly because they all have to live with each other, but quietly, people really just wanted him gone. And even Jerry Jones, who was probably his biggest ally or strongest ally, even he would sort of hint that, $6 billion is a nice round number. Maybe you want to take this one. And he was dragging the whole league down by that point. Initially he was just an outspoken owner. He was the first owner, so far as I could tell, to charge opposing teams for parking their team buses at the stadium on game days. And he's also the first owner to charge fans to attend preseason or training camp workouts. It should be noted that the other owners quickly started following Snyder, but it took Snyder. Snyder was the first to do that. And so, he alienated the fans. The team stunk. The stadium was falling apart. It was clear the politicians in Washington were not going to allow him to move back to the district. There were so many strikes against him that by the end, the owners just really were trying to push him out the door.
And speaking of valuations and team sales, the league has liberalized its rules regarding the use of private equity money to fund purchases of NFL teams. And why did the league change its rules? And what effect do you think that money is having on team sales?
It's a good question. The NFL was really one of the last, it was, if not the last major league to allow private equity money in. But due to their success at raising more media money, sponsorships, and so forth, the value of these teams now has exploded, and the population of owners who can afford teams has really shrunk. And so they're a victim of their own success, if you want to look at it that way. So they decided, well, let's bring in, let's allow private equity to invest as silent investors. They cannot play any role in controlling the team. And so owners have quickly realized, wow, I can take money off the table, right? If my team's worth $6 billion, I can get $600 million, sell 10%. I could use that to build a stadium. I could use that to buy out my sister. I could use that to, set up a trust for my kids, buy some land. I don't know. You could do lots of things with that amount of money. And so they've quickly realized it gives them a lot of flexibility. And I suspect over time that percentage from 10% will be raised higher. The other leagues, baseball, for example, has 30%. So now, as to what it does to the league, I think it. I understand the economics of it, but I think it dilutes the ownership. I think there's a lot to be said about owners who are losing touch with what fans want. They're more and more insulated from fans themselves. I would say some of the older owners, the Rooneys again, being a good example, are much more down to earth. They don't have a huge amount of wealth outside the team. If you meet Art Rooney, he just looks like a guy who would be at a ball game. He doesn't carry himself like a wealthy owner with lots of leather luggage or whatever. But you introduce private equity, and now you're a little more diluted or one more arm's length away from the way the average fan sees the world. And I think that can be kind of damaging. It's a bit intangible, but I think it's out there. Yeah.
And given the evaluations we've been seeing on teams in sports generally, it's almost nowhere to go but up.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems that way. I mean, look, there's some, there's always a question of whether the NFL gets greedy. And, they're doing a dance right now where everything is going towards streaming. And streaming is Amazon, Netflix, very, very Google and YouTube. These are very wealthy companies that have far more money than the traditional broadcasters like Fox and NBC and CBS. And so the NFL has to be careful. One of its magic bullets, if you want to call it that, is that most of their games are still on over-the-air television. Channel 2 in New York, CBS, Channel 5 for Fox. So most fans can watch most games. They're not exclusively on streaming services. But that's where the money is. And so the NFL is going to have to try and figure out how many more, or how to shift from sort of 90% over the air, 10% streaming, and change that balance without pissing off fans who are their lifeblood.
And yet there will be media rights negotiations at the end of the decade. And given that you have the power of Netflix, the power of YouTube as the leading streamers, do you think that's going to force broadcasters to pay even more and incur more losses to continue NFL rights?
I think they don't have a choice. CBS learned this in 1993 when Fox outbid them for the NFC game package, and CBS had no football for 4 years. And this was CBS, the same CBS that had been showing NFL games since 1956. And suddenly all the promotional power of an NFL game, which, as you remember back in the day, would lead into 60 Minutes and Murder, She Wrote and all these shows, which got free advertising in the NFL broadcast, suddenly evaporated. And the ratings for all those other programs plummeted. And so the CBS folks realized, oh my God, we need to get back into football. And by the way, this is where Jerry's genius was, if you want to call it that, was when he came into the league. Art Modell was the broadcast committee, and it was a pretty cozy deal. They had 3 windows. They had the AFC package, the NFC package, and Monday Night Football. And they had essentially 3 broadcasters, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And Jerry said, why don't we get more bidders? We'll drive up the price. And that's where Fox came in. So now they had 4 bidders for 3 packages, and it led to an escalation in the value. And by the way, this is made in there. Every other league saw this. Wait a second, we need to run more of an auction. And NBA saw it, MLB saw it. So all the other leagues, realized how quickly the media rights were going to accelerate and took advantage of what the NFL had done.
Yes, and not only CBS lost the NFL for 4 years, they lost affiliates because of that. on the broadcast side, major city affiliates switched networks because of it. So they were replaced by weaker stations. So this turned out to be a horrible decision by CBS to bean count, and yet in the long term just lost so much and arguably never really recovered.
Yeah.
We can really say so. Indeed. So now, Jerry Jones and Robert Kraft are not youngsters. They're both in their 80s, and other long-term owners recently passed. Virginia McCaskey of the Chicago Bears, Pat Bowlen of the Broncos. Once Jones and Kraft pass from the scene, who do you think will be the dominant owners comprising the new generation, if you will, of NFL owners?
Well, I'd start with their children. Jonathan Kraft has been with Robert Kraft from the time they entered the league in 1994. He's already very well established. He's a very different personality than Robert, certainly when it comes to speaking to the media. But he's very smart, and he's very well respected inside the NFL. For Jerry Jones, all three of his kids have been active. Jerry Jr., Stephen, and Charlotte. I assume Stephen, as the oldest son, will be the actual control owner. They're all very different than their dad. They've been very possessive of their dad's legacy. They all go about business slightly differently. I don't think they have the luster of their dad. I don't know anybody who would. So I'd say those two sets of children will. John Mara is in his 70s. He'll still be influential, he and Art Rooney. So they've got a while to go. Clark Hunt, I think, is a name people will see. Of course, the Chiefs are kind of on top of the football world the last 6-7 years. He's in his mid-50s. He's on important committees, the finance committee. He was leading the special committee that allowed for private equity. He's no drama. Some would say he's kind of bland. But sometimes the NFL on certain issues, likes to have no drama and no histrionics. He doesn't spout off in the media. You don't really see him out in public on the red carpet, those kind of things. So Clark Hunt's a name, Shad Khan as well on certain committees, the equity committee, and Greg Penner, a relatively new owner, with the Denver Broncos, and Jimmy Haslam, of the Cleveland Browns, have both been very active. And then one last name I'll throw out there is Josh Harris, who, is a co-founder of Apollo, the giant private equity group. And he bought the Commanders, and they've had very good success in a very short period of time. I think nobody misses Dan Snyder for many reasons, and one of which is Josh is doing a very good job. He's likely to get a stadium back in Washington, D.C., and they're going to get the draft and maybe even a Super Bowl someday.
And on the international front, of course, more and more games are being played internationally. Do you see the day that the NFL would award a franchise to a non-U.S. city?
I don't see it. People talk about it all the time. One owner, I think it was Clark Hunt, was saying, until we see supersonic travel, where it's 3 hours to get from London to New York instead of 5 or 6 or 7, we're really not going to see a team playing over there. There's so many extra hurdles, logistically. For instance, just even in season, if your linebacker gets hurt on Sunday in London and you need to go find a linebacker, where do you try them out? In America, you call up 7 free agent linebackers who are hanging out in Texas or Arizona and have them fly to Chicago to do a workout. 2 hours, 2-hour flight, 3-hour flight, and then either go home that night or you put them up for a night. In London, you got to get a passport. Many players don't even own passports. So you'd have to have a second facility in the States, and that's Tuesday for a workout. And then you got to get them there by Sunday to play the game. I mean, there's so many logistical hurdles. There are legal hurdles. Players may not want to live overseas. Their families may not want to live overseas. Well, then you got a situation where the mom or the wife and the kids want to stay at home because of schools. Well, that's a whole other issue, tax issues. So it's very complicated. And, it's been dangled out there. I just don't see it. The other final point I'll make, which has been made to me by several owners, is that if it's a new franchise, well, then you're diluting the other 32 shares. So the entry point for that new franchise is going to have to make up for the dilution of the other owners. So you're talking about billions of dollars in expansion fees, and that limits who can own a team. If it's an existing franchise, name the team, let's say the Jets, for argument's sake, move to London. Well, the other teams in a division, Dolphins, Bills, Patriots, are going to have to fly to London every year. So that's guaranteed they're going to play a game in London, assuming it's London. And then you do the math. Where else are they going to have a team? So you're going to want it to have a team in London and somewhere else in Europe. So there's some natural rivalry also. You're not going to have one team. And so really it's so complicated, and I think so far out. The NFL now just wants to create a media package first. That's really what they want. They're at 8 international games now. They'd like to get up to 16 before they ever think about a franchise.
And a final question. When do you think Roger Goodell will retire, and who do you think could replace him?
It's people have suspected that he was going to retire when he hit 65. He's already there now. I think he doesn't really aspire to do much else. He's not going to sit at home. His daughters are grown up. He loves doing what he does. He still has a lot of energy. He has complained to people, who I spoke to, sort of moaning and saying, yeah, it's getting tiring. But, these people who know him well say, that's all an act. There's no place he'd rather be. He's good at it. He's at the top of his game. And does he want to be a corporate board advisor? I mean, I just don't think it provides the same stimulus as to who, and he has a contract which will expire and I suspect will be, renewed. The short answer is the owners are not going to seek to replace him until he's ready to go. He's been bringing in so much money to them that they, would never kill the golden goose, so to speak. As to replaces him, it's probably going to be somebody from the media world, not from the sports world. Roger is kind of one of one. He spent his entire life at one organization. You're not going to find anybody like that. There's some very talented people at the NFL. Whether they have the juice to play outside the NFL, I don't know, but it doesn't appear to be that case. There may be somebody I'm not aware of. Brian Rolapp, the former head of media, was considered to be one of those people, but he left for the PGA. So, there are talented people there. Whether they're commissioner material, I kind of doubt it.
On that note, we have to come to the end of our time. On behalf of Fordham University, the Gabelli School of Business, and the Sports Business Initiative, I want to extend my thanks to Ken Belson of the New York Times and the author of Every Day is Sunday, How Jerry Jones, Robert Kraft, and Roger Goodell Turned the NFL into a Cultural and Economic Juggernaut. The book has just been published by Grand Central Publishers. It is available online and in bookstores. It is a fascinating and important read for fans of football, the NFL, sports, and national culture. I also want to thank my producer, Victoria Elano, for her great work in preparing and editing this episode. And finally, many thanks to all of you for listening. For the Sports Business Podcast at Fordham's Gabelli School of Business, I'm Mark Conrad, or Prof. C. Have a great day.